Imagine it's September 21st, 2017. You're a pharmacist in Ponce, Puerto Rico. Hurricane Maria made landfall 4 days ago. The store is structurally intact. The shelves are largely undamaged. Your inventory is cataloged, organized, exactly where it should be. You have medications people need, insulin for diabetics, blood pressure pills, antibiotics, and you cannot dispense a single one of them. Not because they're gone, because the computer is dead. The verification system requires internet connectivity. The point of sale terminal requires power. Your backup generator ran out of diesel 18 hours ago, and the 3 stations within driving distance have lines stretching 6 blocks, assuming they have fuel at all, assuming their pumps are working, which they are not, because pumps run on electricity, and the grid that powered this entire island is down. You have a store full of merchandise and no mechanism to conduct commerce. 3 miles away, a retired electrician named Carlos is doing something that would have seemed absurd 1 week ago. He is charging his neighbors $5 per hour for access to his generator. Not the generator itself, not the fuel, the electricity it produces. His neighbors are not paying him in credit cards or digital transfers. They are paying him in cash, in canned food, in prescription medications they grabbed from their own cabinets before the storm. They are paying him in whatever they have that he might want. Carlos is not wealthy. He was not wealthy before the storm, but in the specific economic reality that materialized the moment the grid went down, he holds something that everyone around him needs and almost no one else has. This is not a disaster story. This is a mechanics lesson. Every time a power grid fails, for any reason, for any duration, the same transfer of value occurs with the same consistency that we have documented in currency collapses, in hyperinflations, and supply chain breakdowns across every continent and every century. Certain items, ordinary items that most people walk past in hardware stores and supermarkets without registering their significance, become dramatically more valuable. Not because sentiment changes, not because of panic buying, though that accelerates the process, but because of a structural reality that was always true and simply becomes visible the moment the infrastructure hiding it goes dark. The grid is not background noise. It is the operating system on which modern commerce runs. Remove it, and the entire value hierarchy of everyday goods resets. What was abundant becomes scarce. What was overlooked becomes essential, and the people who understood which items would shift value before the shift occurred find themselves in Carlos's position rather than the pharmacists. This is documented history. It happened in Puerto Rico in 2017, when 11 months of partial grid outage produced one of the most forensically complete records of grid-down economics in the modern era. It happened in Texas in February 2021, when a winter storm took down the ERCOT grid for 11 days and left 4.5 million households without power. It happened in Lebanon beginning in 2019, where rolling blackouts extending to 20 hours per day collapsed the formal economy and rebuilt an informal one around whoever controlled generators and fuel. It has happened in Venezuela, in South Sudan, in parts of coastal Japan following the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. The pattern is identical every time, and once you see it, it does not require imagination to understand. It requires only arithmetic. Item 1. Potable water. This is the one most people believe they understand and almost universally underestimate. The assumption is simple. Water comes from a tap. When the tap works, water is essentially free. When a natural disaster hits, people buy bottled water in advance and consider the problem solved. What this assumption misses is the infrastructure dependency of municipal water systems. Clean water does not arrive at a tap by gravity alone, or at least not in most cities. It arrives because pumping stations and filtration facilities run continuously on electrical power. When the grid goes down, those stations stop. Depending on elevation, pressure, and reservoir capacity, a municipal system can maintain water service for anywhere from several hours to a few days on residual pressure. After that, the taps run dry. In Puerto Rico following Maria, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers documented that over 1.5 million people lost access to potable water within the first 72 hours. By the second week, wells were being dug in public parks. People were collecting rainwater from tarps. Those with water filtration equipment, ceramic filters, pump-style backpacking filters, even basic activated charcoal systems, found themselves holding one of the most negotiable assets on the island. The documented exchange rates that emerged were striking. In communities documented by relief organizations operating in the interior municipalities, a basic filtration device capable of processing 2 liters per hour was trading for amounts equivalent to several weeks of pre-storm wages. People with cisterns and hand-operated pumps could dictate terms for nearly any other goods or services they required. The mechanism is straightforward. A human body requires approximately 2 to 3 liters of water per day to survive. Not to be comfortable, to survive. This is a floor defined by biology, not economics. Unlike almost every other need, it cannot be deferred, substituted, or rationed below a minimum threshold. Water does not lose demand during a crisis. It gains urgency. Item 2. Fuel. In January 2021, Uri hit Texas. Temperatures dropped to levels not recorded in the state in over a century. The grid failed. People froze. Within 48 hours, gasoline had become one of the most sought-after commodities in the state, not because vehicles had become more important, but because generators had. And generators run on fuel. And fuel, under normal conditions, is dispensed by electrically powered pumps at electrically powered stations on a grid that no longer existed. This is the mechanism most people fail to model in advance. They see a gas tank that is three-quarters full and consider themselves prepared. What they have not modeled is that every other driver with a three-quarters full tank is having the same thought, and that when those tanks approach empty, the pumps will not work. Not because the fuel is gone, but because the infrastructure to dispense it requires the same power grid that has failed. In documented accounts from Venezuelan grid degradation between 2019 and 2021, where rolling blackouts became a permanent feature of daily life, fuel access emerged as one of the primary stratifiers of economic survival. Those who had stored fuel in jerry cans, not in enormous quantities, but in modest reserves of 20 to 40 liters, occupied a negotiating position unavailable to those who had not. They could power generators, they could transport goods, they could charge money for both services. The irony documented in Texas was precise. The state, sitting on some of the largest petroleum reserves in North America, ran dry at the street level not because production stopped, but because the distribution network, powered by the same grid that had failed, could not move product from supply to demand. Fuel in a grid-down scenario is not what it is in a functioning economy. In a functioning economy, fuel is a commodity. In a grid-down scenario, fuel is an enabling asset. It is the item that makes all other items accessible. The person with fuel can generate power. The person with fuel can transport goods. The person with fuel is, in a specific and documented sense, the person with options that no one else has. Item 3. Cash. This one is counterintuitive in a direction that exposes how thoroughly the digital economy has rewired expectations about how commerce functions. The standard assumption is that cash is old-fashioned, that it is being displaced, that fewer and fewer transactions require it, that a phone and a card are sufficient for modern life. This assumption functions perfectly until the grid goes down. Card readers require power. Point-of-sale terminals require internet connectivity. ATMs require electricity to operate, and when they go offline, they do not dispense. Digital wallets require devices that need charging. Online banking requires servers that require power. The entire apparatus of modern electronic payment depends on continuous, uninterrupted electrical infrastructure. The moment that infrastructure fails, the only medium of exchange that continues functioning without modification is physical currency. In the documented accounts from Puerto Rico, a pattern emerged within the first 24 hours that relief workers described as disorienting. Stores with functional inventory could not sell it because terminals were down. Customers with money in bank accounts, with balances on credit cards, with digital funds in every technical sense, could not access those funds. Commerce froze along digital lines. The only transactions completing were cash transactions. The economic disruption this created was not theoretical. It was documented in case studies by the Federal Emergency Management Agency and in journalistic accounts from the months following Maria. People who held cash could eat. People whose wealth existed only in digital form were dependent on charity or barter until systems came back online, which in many interior municipalities took months. In Lebanon, where grid instability became normalized after 2019, the premium on physical dollar bills over bank-held dollar deposits reached 40 and 50% in informal markets. The same denomination existed in two forms, one accessible and one trapped, and the market assigned them different values accordingly. Cash in a grid-down scenario is not a financial instrument. It is a mechanism that bypasses the dependency that all other financial instruments share. Item 4. Manual tools and hand-powered equipment. This category sounds pedestrian until you have tried to open a can of food with an electric can opener that no longer has power, or attempted to maintain a household on zero tools that function without electricity. The modern household has outsourced nearly every physical process to electrically powered equipment. Lighting, food preparation, communication, information, entertainment, climate control, food preservation. The electrical grid is not a convenience. It is the operational infrastructure on which the entire functionality of the modern home depends. When it disappears, the household discovers immediately which functions are possible and which are not. In the documented accounts from Northeast Japan following the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, communities that lost grid access for periods ranging from days to months recorded a rapid premium on tools and equipment that required no electrical input. Hand-powered water pumps, which had been antiques in most households, became community assets. Manual grain mills emerged from storage rooms where they had sat for decades. Kerosene lamps, mechanical alarm clocks, hand tools of every description commanded trade values substantially above their pre-disaster market equivalents. The mechanism is not sentiment, it is substitution. In a functioning economy, electric tools are valuable because they perform work faster and with less labor than manual alternatives. In a grid-down scenario, the comparison inverts. The manual tool performs work. The electric tool performs nothing. The comparative value shifts absolutely, not incrementally. In Texas, during URI, residents documented paying prices ranging from 10 to 20 times normal market value for battery-powered and hand-cranked devices because the secondary market cleared at whatever price someone was willing to pay, and people were willing to pay a great deal for functionality and conditions that threatened their lives. A month follow a fight. Item 5. Locally produced or preserved food. The final category completes the pattern because it addresses the item that all other items ultimately exist to secure. Modern food supply chains are among the most grid-dependent systems in existence. Cold storage requires continuous power. Transport logistics depend on fuel that depends on electrically powered distribution. Retail point of sale depends on electronic payments. The refrigerated sections of grocery stores begin warming within 4 hours of a power outage. Frozen goods begin thawing. Perishables approach their safety limits. In Puerto Rico, by the end of the first week following Maria, FEMA documented widespread food scarcity in interior municipalities not because food production had stopped, but because the supply chain connecting production to consumption had fragmented. The farms still existed, the harvests were still occurring, but the cold chain, the transport network, and the retail mechanism were all offline. The documented outcome was the same pattern that has appeared in every grid-down scenario studied. Agricultural producers, people with gardens, with livestock, with food preservation capabilities like canning, smoking, and drying, emerged as the economic anchors of their communities. Their output did not depend on the grid because it never had. The grid had been irrelevant to the production of a tomato. It became irrelevant to the value of one as well. In Venezuela's grid degradation, this pattern extended over years rather than weeks. Those with backyard cultivation, with root cellars, with preserved goods, occupied a position of consistent economic advantage over those dependent on a formal food system that could not function reliably. The informal economy organized around food production in ways that the formal economy had not enabled for generations. The pattern? Step back from the 5 categories and look at what they share. Water, fuel, cash, manual tools, locally produced food. None of these are sophisticated, none are products of financial engineering, none require institutional infrastructure to deliver their value. They function in the dark. They function when the servers are offline, when the card readers are dead, when the digital economy has gone silent. They are valuable not because anyone decided they would be valuable in a crisis. They are valuable because they address needs that exist independent of the infrastructure that normally mediates them. They sit outside the dependency chain, and when that chain breaks, the items outside it are the only ones still working. The items that lose value, the items whose owners find themselves holding something increasingly useless, are the items whose value depended entirely on the infrastructure that no longer exists. Digital currency, credit balances, delivery subscriptions, anything requiring the grid to function. The pattern is mechanical. It is documented. It is not prediction. It is forensics. The people who fared best in Puerto Rico after Maria, in Texas after Uri, in Lebanon after its grid began its slow collapse, were not the wealthiest before the crisis. They were not the most financially sophisticated. They were the people whose preparations happened to sit outside the dependency that the crisis exposed. Some of them understood this in advance. Most of them were simply in the right position by accident. The question is not whether grids fail. They do. The historical record across the last 50 years includes dozens of significant grid failures in developed and developing nations, each producing identical value shifts, each rewarding the same categories of preparation, each penalizing the same categories of exposure. The question is whether you understand the mechanism before the lights go out or only after. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice, emergency preparedness advice, or a recommendation to take any specific action. Historical patterns do not guarantee future events. Every grid failure has unique characteristics. The only appropriate response to this information is understanding, not prediction, but understanding, as the documented record suggests, has historically been worth a great deal. The pattern is already visible. The only variable is whether you can see it before you need to.